Hey, hello. It looks like we are up and running. So let me just get everything. I thought I was going to be so on top of things because I had everything scheduled out and whatnot. But, the best laid plans, as they say. So, hello. Welcome. Excuse me. I've got multiple beverages here just in case because I can tell I haven't really talked a lot today. So I was worried about the phlegmies, but I know, super appetizing, appealing right out of the gate. But we are here to talk about The Buccaneers by Edith Wharton. The book specifically kind of inspired by the new Apple Plus show, but I have purposefully not watched an episode yet because I wanted to talk about the book as its own thing. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of have a communal discussion, though admittedly very, very last minute. Ideally, I would love to do this again for Romancing Mr. Bridgerton prior to Bridgerton coming out. But this book has been sitting on my TBR for years and years. While this copy looks like it came straight out of the 90s, it did in fact not. It came out of like 2016-ish. I bought it when I was a bookseller. I will say, small gripe here. The cover has one of these covers. I know I've complained about them before, but it's a deep cut complaint. So I'm going to do it again, where it has this little perforation. And I get it. It helps, open the book more, but it annoys me. It annoys me. So either way, we're here to talk about this book. I will say there are definitely going to be spoilers in this discussion, Shirley. So while I encourage anyone to continue to hang out with us, you don't have to have read the book. I am glad you were here regardless. There are going to be spoilers. Now, that being said, I have been avoiding spoilers of the show. So I guess we're all in the kind of the same boat. Words are hard. You're going to realize how much editing I really do today, I think. Got a little warm. I've got a blanket. Okay, so I have a Storygraph read along linked in the chat. It isn't super robust because everything was incredibly last minute, as you surely know. And because of that, there hasn't been a whole lot of activity, including from myself on that, but I also wanted to test out the Storygraph feature. And so even though it hasn't been incredibly robust, there are still discussions and points on that. And so I will probably be referencing it on my phone so I can still see the chat if anyone drops in. But if we do want to put that onto the screen, I haven't tried that yet, but we can always try that as well. So the first thing about the Buccaneers, not the Buccaneers, and I will probably slip, I just realized last night, I was so confident in my mispronunciation. So apologies to anyone who has watched my the Bridgertonification of classics video because I mispronounce it through the entire video with such confidence. But this was Edith Wharton's last novel, and it was not complete at the time she passed away. So the edition I have is the one that was finished by Marion Mainwaring in the 90s. And so it is a continuation. It is not completely by Edith Wharton, but it is based completely off of her notes. She had the whole thing sketched out, most notably the ending. And this is why I say spoilers will definitely happen, because this ending for me as a Wharton novel was so unexpected. And one spoiler I saw going into the novel was that the ending is kind of unexpected for a Wharton novel, which kind of gave me hints about which way it would lean. But I found that really, really interesting. So I promise I have thoughts gathered to talk about. One thing I found notable in this edition, especially considering it is a completion of this unfinished work by one of the most notable writers in the American canon, is that there isn't a foreword to this edition or like any real exploration of the text in the way that I am used to as a reader now. And notably, I had to look up where Edith Wharton stopped and where Marion Marion Mainwaring began in the book. Now, granted, I read that Edith Wharton had completed up through about chapter 29, but there is this kind of line in the middle of chapter 30 with no explanation that leads me to believe that that is where the kind of barrier is in the text and the kind of before and after of what is Edith Wharton and what is Marion Mainwaring. And I found it interesting because I do think that it was completed in a way that wasn't ultimately too jarring, but I had a real knowledge, or there was this sense that there was a difference in the kind of tone of it. It felt like it was emulating Edith Wharton. It was trying to kind of smooth out. And I did find it interesting because I found a quote I couldn't completely source from Marion Mainwaring that said that she was able to complete this because it wasn't Wharton's best work and that she wouldn't have tried this with the likes of like Charlotte Bronte and Austen, which I took a little bit of umbrage with because I do think that Wharton is such a big voice. But it's interesting to think about then how scholars position this within the canon of Wharton's work. Now, I have read, for full context, because I think that really does come into play when considering Wharton, is Age of Innocence. I read in high school, so I really need to revisit the text. I have a beautiful copy. I've read House of Mirth, which I also need to reread. I read that in college, and I also read Summer in college, and I remember nothing about Summer. I'm going to be completely honest there. And then I've read Ethan Frome, and I have The Custom of the Country. But prior to this, the Buccaneers and Custom of the Country were the kind of two big novels I was holding in reserve for when I needed them. So where I think the difference in the language is really interesting, to kind of go broad strokes before we really dive into more specifics, if desired, feel free to jump into this conversation if you want, whether you've read the book or not at any time, because I do hope that we can have a conversation in some capacity, whether it be live here or in the comments in the replay that ideally will succeed in going up. So I find Wharton's language, I was trying really hard to pin Wharton's language down the entire time I was reading this book because it is so distinct in my memory and my kind of idea as a reader, but it is kind of hard to succinctly talk about. And I also feel like it's hard for me right now to succinctly talk about anything. This is like the book club version of Melody, right? Where I'm just kind of rambling off. I apologize. But there's some like real sharp wit and insight and like a real subtle wit. Like it's that very much that drawing room. You get the sense, because it's true, that Wharton was raised in this kind of upper crust society. So she's really commenting in these books about society, about a world that she knows very well. And so there is a razor sharp incision in terms of these takedowns. And one thing that I saw in kind of my brief looking around about this book, I did pop onto JSTOR, but I ultimately didn't read any full in-depth articles because I wanted to be able to approach this conversation a little bit more organically. So how nice it is that I can just jump onto JSTOR. Also, apologies if I am talking incredibly quickly. I am a little nervous. I'm not going to lie to you. So one thing I find really telling about her language is just how she's able to so quickly and insightfully really dig into these characters and these people in a way that provides this really clear overview and picture, but doesn't feel like it's didactic or that we are being told a thing. It still feels like this observance that is rooted in some action, and action is obviously going to function much differently in a book like this than in a contemporary novel. And I think that that is interesting too in relation to the structure. Now, like I said, it's been a second since I've read a Wharton, but one thing I found very interesting about this novel was that it was broken up into 4 parts and that there were significant time jumps between most of those parts. There's not a significant or really at all a time jump between parts 3 and 4. Excuse me. But we have those jumps in between parts 1 and 2, 2 and 3, you get the picture. And those jumps are usually kind of anchored by a wedding. And so we're seeing what life was like before this wedding and then after. And everything is kind of framed by this idea of marriage and how marriage works for women at this time and women in society at this time. Because, as I probably should have said at the beginning, because I can't assume a familiarity with this book for everyone here, or I hope that everyone here doesn't have a familiarity with this book because it will really limit our conversation, right? Is that this is about American heiresses going to England and seeking husbands, and this idea that these lords at the time, these men that have titles, needed funds, and these heiresses could provide the funds in exchange for this title. Welcome, Amy. Great. I want to ask, have you seen the new show or have you seen the BBC edition? Because I'm going to jump into the new show tonight, ideally. But I actually was reading some things about the BBC version as I was kind of poking around after I finished the book, that I was like, I don't know how I feel about that in terms of interpretation of character and some of the stuff they added in to the end. And I found that interesting mostly because, and again, I haven't seen the BBC edition, so this is me just kind of talking theoretically, that I usually consider the BBC editions to be more true to the text. And this took some interpretive liberties with the text that kind of threw me, specifically in what I was reading in terms of, excuse me, I'm going to look up this pronunciation again, because I obviously pronounced the Buccaneers wrong for a significant time, but the title, the Duke of, oh my gosh, did I get rid of the pronunciation guide? Tintagel? I think it's Tintagel, or as he's called in the book, Ushant, which I've also probably mispronounced now. But Nan's, well, that's a spoiler. We said we were going to talk about spoilers, but Nan's eventual husband. I forget where I was in my thought process now. I'm so sorry. So we had these time jumps. We were looking at, okay, so the idea of the book is that these heiresses are going over to England for money. And so I've always known that concept. I'll stop clicking this pen, as you can probably hear. Sorry, we are still working off a computer microphone. I'm hoping to upgrade a microphone soon. But I had this idea going into the book that we were going to be dealing with old money in relation to these women going over to marry for the title. And we are not. We open the book with this kind of friction between the idea of old money and new money, and also this idea of change that I think is throughout the whole thing. The new show. Okay, I'm reading. Feels very modern, and I'm curious how much they've changed from the book. That's something I'm going to be interested too, because as we are talking about structure, one thing I noted as I was reading, and part of the reason I wanted to read the whole book before going back to the show, is I think that they're going to change a lot in terms of structure, because as I mentioned, we have these kind of time gaps, and we're going to find out how wrong I was very quickly. You already know, I don't. But we have these like big gaps in time. And for me, especially when you talk about the modernization of it and the kind of sense and tone I get from the trailer, which I'm really intrigued by, I have this feeling that we're going to kind of condense that and expedite that action in terms of raising the stakes, because there is this sense in the book of everything feeling a little bit more drawn out, this idea that it is this kind of thing that you have to sit with, the idea of these difficult marriages and what you have married for, the kind of maneuvering and gain and the getting of a husband, but then what you're married to and what marriage looks like, especially for Nan, who in the book is this kind of idealistic, romantic, childish for most of the book character. What I really found notable was how often they referred to Nan as childish, and both the kind of correlation between her kind of love of ideas and studying and art as childish, but also this idea she was childish because she did romanticize things, but then the way that people were attracted to her for that childishness, which is kind of problematic, obviously, but it was this idea that how they viewed her and how they kind of transposed this idea that she was shapeable on that. And I found it really interesting in terms of her relationship and this kind of flirtation with Guy Thornton in the book. Again, correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, because I haven't watched the show yet. That as an adult, I'm like, okay, they don't know each other that well. How are they in love? But it is this kind of suspension of disbelief in this world that you kind of go on for a lot of books. And Wharton novels are very notable for their affairs. And so these two do seem more suited to each other than Nan and Tintagel or Ushant. But I still feel like there is a certain level of Guy Thornton kind of turning her in his mind into what he believes she is rather than what she is. And so we see her coming into her own a lot in this novel as well. I'm going to pull up my notes in the Storygraph read along just to hopefully be able to keep me in terms of what I want to touch on. I have this nice to-do list that's just like my character list because I'm like, I'm going to forget who's who because I have like the Elmsworth sisters. Actually, you know what? I don't know that I ever wrote down the second Elmsworth sister. It starts with an M. She's the one who marries an heir or like a fortune over in Illinois, which I found interesting that it wasn't from Chicago. But okay, I'm going to go to my general discussion note section here. Oh, I can't on that because I'm on a different account. Cute. All right, we're going to see if this interrupts. No, we're good. Okay. Hold, please. I apologize. And I could in theory throw this up, but I'm afraid of, I guess it doesn't completely matter if I can see the chat, but I want to be able to talk to you directly because that's the whole point. So as I'm going, I do think that one, I can't spell apparently, but that we are going to expedite the timeline of the book in order to raise those stakes, make things feel more active, make them feel more current. I'm also going to be very interested. I got a kind of sense of frenzied, kind of frantic tone to the trailer, the way it was cut, which I really appreciated. I also really appreciated the Olivia Rodrigo song choice, but I'm going to be interested to see if that kind of frenzy carries over into the show, especially in the early parts with the group of girls, because I definitely got the sense of that frenzy in the book. And the frankness with which it talked about some of this impropriety was really interesting to me. And I do think it goes back to one, again, Wharton has always kind of discussed or explored some of these issues of impropriety at the time in her work. If we go back to like The Age of Innocence or The House of Mirth, but it felt like it was very bold here. And I think part of that may be that it was written so long after the time it's set. So it's set in the 1870s at kind of the height of the Gilded Age. We are looking at this idea of change because when we start the book, actually, I know I mentioned this in my notes, this idea that the St. George's aren't really in their new money. And at the beginning of the book, it doesn't really feel like they're really in the money. Don't make me break out into the song at the time, because it talks about is it the Colonel kind of betting on horses, this idea that Wall Street really does replicate gambling in a lot of ways, and this idea that he's making these business deals. And so I think that it's one, Wharton, we know, was part of the old money Knickerbocker set. And so the fact that she's focusing on the new money, and it does have that kind of sharpness and that real kind of cultural insight and narrative. I don't know, I'm not finding the right words for it at the moment, but there is this real ability to cut to the heart of a person and really understand someone that I think is really indicative of Wharton's work that I really appreciate. And so it does that, but not in a way that it feels like it's always talking down to the new money for the idea of being new money, if that makes sense, because she is just as razor sharp with the old money and kind of showing them in these kind of like old staid kind of ways. And then just this juxtaposition of this kind of new vitality of these new money girls and how they're kind of like going against these staid conventions. And so there is a real great juxtaposition there that isn't seeming to favor one side versus the other. It cuts sharply. I know I'm going to be using the same words again and again because they're what's at the top of my mind. I apologize for both groups. And so I find that really interesting that we are opening with this idea of change. And so there is change throughout this novel, even as this group, Mrs. St. George, views herself as established and old money in some ways. She knows she's not old money. This idea that even after they buy a house, they haven't bought a house in the popular or fashionable part of town. And so she's always kind of chasing this idea. At the same time, she's clinging to the image of her husband, even as he doesn't treat her well, and just like what the image of her husband is. But we know they're at Saratoga for the summer for the races. So we've already got this association with gambling, both with the idea of the races and then kind of compounded by this idea of Wall Street. And she's judging everyone around her. So she's like the big fish, at least in her mind, in this small pond. But we also know at the beginning of this book that Saratoga isn't the hot place to summer anymore for this set. And so we're already seeing that kind of force of change and what that force of change will be. And then this is furthered as it goes, one, as the St. Georges come into more money, but then the idea of these American women kind of entering the fold across the pond and how they're perceived in that community, in that society versus here. And I noted too how there is a lot of language and adjectives and whatnot that talk about how fast things move for these girls, how fast the Americans move. And so there's this sense of the speed of them as characters and this kind of cultural difference, but it also feels like it's a commentary on the way the world is changing and that kind of tension there, especially because the book is being written nostalgically, in the sense, not that she is looking favorably on this world, because she clearly has a very insightful, kind of clear picture of it. She's able to really take down the people on all sides to kind of their bare boards, brass tacks. Those aren't the right words, but I forget where I was. I had a really great point in my head and I distracted myself. I apologize. Dear Lord, this is book club too for me. Like I get on a roll, I have thoughts up here, and then suddenly they're gone. It was something related to the juxtaposition and this idea of change. Oh, we're looking back. This would all normally be cut out. I'm sorry. We're looking back. And so this was written, well, she died in 1937. So again, I didn't fully log on to JSTOR here, but it was written probably in the late 20s, early 30s. And there is this sense of it's referring to a world that is gone at the time that it's written, because we are in a post-World War I world at the time the book came out eventually, because it was published unfinished until the 90s when it was finished, to my understanding of the kind of timeline there. But again, this edition doesn't have a nice, helpful introduction to give me more insight into the history of the novel, which really would have been great. But maybe the new releases for the show have more front matter there. Okay, I do think they have left some things out of the book this season to make a second. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'm interested in that. So maybe they're treating the time jumps that way. I mean, again, I will see. I'm not going to speculate too much, just because I will be wrong. And sometimes I don't like to be wrong. But I think that that's interesting. And it goes back to my ideas with kind of the emulation of Bridgerton. And again, I think everything is in conversation. So I'm interested in this, obviously, but like, why do we need to drag things out? Because even this book, so much of Wharton is longer because we are getting these really like clear character studies that take place in these paragraphs that then can be condensed into action in the show. They would have to be. Let me see if I know I tabbed one. It is the she talks about Brit Britlingsley. I'm pronouncing it wrong. Absolutely. Um Anyway, when they're talking about Lord Britlingsley, and I'm sure I'm mangling all of the pronunciations and the titles, I apologize. There is a real that is one of my favorite kind of character studies in the sense that it talks about how self-absorbed he is and how unobservant he is in such specific terms, and the way that he kind of perceives his wife and his daughters in relation to him, and this idea that people fade to the background if they don't immediately benefit him, and the whole backstory with him and Mrs. March, which almost feels comical in its hyperbole in the way it's relayed here. This idea that they were engaged at one point, she'd already ordered the wedding dresses, very Miss Havisham in some ways, but like the kind of opposite of Miss Havisham. And so they had this engagement that he breaks, and she is left alone in London and ends up staying there, makes friends with his wife, and is in similar circles or running in similar sets, but he does not remember her. Like, that's how much he cares about things that no longer serve him, that his wife and daughters have to remind him to be kind to this woman that he jilted years ago. And also the way that it kind of illustrates how things go unsaid in these sets at the same time that we're seeing this countered by actions like Lady Chert, who I will be very interested to see if she is further explored in the television show. Sorry, I'm going to drink some of this coffee. Don't mind me, because I feel like she is a very interesting character in the book. And again, we get such quick glimpses of some of these really interesting characters, and Wharton is able to communicate so much about characters, so much about these people in such a short time. And I think it goes back to the opening with Mrs. St. George, because it is a kind of like slow lay of the land at the opening in a way that should feel slow but doesn't, because it's such a takedown of Mrs. St. George and her character, while also revealing the real kind of conundrum of the time. And then it kind of flips it. At first, we see this like very typical judgmental society lady, but then as we move further into that section as well, we see a lot more of the complications, especially with her marriage, which is really interesting. And there's this way that Wharton makes us feel a little sympathetic at times to some of these characters, while also reminding us how horrible of people they are. And I do think it's very interesting in that, because this book addresses things like racism in a way that is more insightful than I expected it to be. It's not perfect by any means, clearly, but it does address it. Or even things like when Guy Forte goes to, just, is he have mines in Brazil that he's working later? And it talks about how he leaves this business deal with his former father-in-law because he finds out how the workers in these mines are being treated, and acknowledges the essentially slave labor that is being utilized there in a way that many modern historical romances have just started to grapple with themselves. And so I think that is very interesting, because that was something I was expecting to have to kind of suspend a little bit, like do a little bit of like, it was the time, but it definitely handled it in a way that, or with a frankness I wasn't expecting, I should say. So that was interesting. And so it is this kind of friction again, that we keep going back to between the modern and the new and the old. This idea of new and old money from the beginning. This idea of, these heiresses going over to England, and this, like, the history and the age of these titles versus this new money that's coming in, combined with the worldview in which the book is being written. And I think it still resonates today in a lot of ways. And I don't know where I'm fully going with that, but I promise there was a thought there. So, going back to my kind of initial perceptions, that I thought that they were going to be the center. So I wrote on Storygraph, and I don't know if you can see the notes I put in Storygraph unless you are, like, in the read along, which I think you can still join at any time and see these notes if you are at all interested. I'm not pretending that they are super insightful, revelatory, but they are there. So I said, going in, I was very much expecting that St. George's, or the St. George's, to be at the height of New York society, but they are decidedly not. It presents an extra layer of appearances and judgment contrasted against the youthful flightiness of the girls. Keep in mind, I was writing this note as I was reading. Also interesting, as book one definitely feels like the setup of New York to be contrasted against the rest of the book, which I stand by, and also make the St. George's more interesting in contrasting them against the old money of New York and London. This idea that they're kind of searching to belong anywhere, which comes in at the end too, because Nan doesn't really have a normal to go back to. And this idea that she's kind of been cast adrift in so many ways, which is in line with a lot of Wharton endings, even if the ultimate ending still isn't. We'll get there, but I am trying to tease it a little bit so that people that don't want to be spoiled do have that kind of to come. Though now I'm very interested in where the show left off, because ideally, like, it is very open-ended in the ending of the book, a more hopeful open-ended than we get in other Wharton novels, where it's like, this woman is exiled. This woman, spoiler alert, died of an overdose after paying all her debts. I need to reread The House of Mirth. It, isn't super mirthful. That's the point. It's the irony, isn't it? So I don't know what happens to the protagonist in The Custom of the Country, but I imagine it's not good. Though I think that from what I've read, she is a more kind of unlikable character than some of the others, which also interesting. Okay, and then I have another, I'm going to just read through some of these thoughts because I wrote them to hopefully guide me here. But then also, so we're still in section 1, the idea of Miss Test Valley and Lord Richard. So we've got Lord Richard, who marries Conchita, and there's the sense that there's some impropriety there in the kind of rushed nature of that marriage, that we kind of like skip ahead, right? We're like, they're getting married, and then they're like, we're married, and we see Conchita in this marriage and not super happy in the marriage, which makes sense knowing the history that we know of Lord Richard. And in part 1, I was having trouble kind of figuring out the ages of these characters, because Miss Test Valley is in her mid 30, almost 30. I wrote it down somewhere. Nearly 40, page 64. I put that because I searched for it. So at the time I was like, okay, that means Lord Richard is much older. Like, I was having trouble thinking that way. I don't know why. Of course, this much older man was marrying this very young girl for her money, and then finding out much later in the book that there was a pregnancy that expedited that marriage. And so thinking back then, we see the kind of glimpses of these girls running around at Saratoga and in and out of rooms, and kind of like the laughing and the practical jokes in a way that, like, it talks about Nan leaving the cottage in London for her nerves, basically. Miss Test Valley decides like it's too overstimulating for her. And I was like, I get it. If I had all of these young people running around, flirting in and out of each other's rooms, playing practical jokes, you've always got Teddy in the hall playing his guitar, presumably, seemingly. It's always talking about him playing his guitar. There is a level there of just like overstimulation that, I maybe 5 or 10 years ago would have been like, I don't know. And now I'm like, yeah, I'd want out of there too. So with back to Miss Test Valley, she had a relationship isn't the right word, but there was a history between her and Lord Richard where he had clearly seduced her when she was the governess of his sisters. And that I found Miss Test Valley very interesting because she becomes this real confidant of Nan, but just like her station, what she can see, that she becomes so invested in these young women, and in some ways almost feels like it's that she's living vicariously through them. There is a where is it? There is a line in here that really just got me in relation to Test Valley. Oh, that's just her commenting on the summer rooms. I know I marked it. Oh, I did find the oh no, that's the character study of the Duke of Tintagel, which is interesting. He really loves clocks in a way that I couldn't help. I know it's not clocks, but I just kept thinking of the Marie Antoinette movie there. But then also it mentions later like the idea of like the clockmaker god kind of like theory and like order and rule. And so there's a lot of symbolism to the clocks, but he really likes clocks. So back to Lady or Miss Test Valley. There's a line on page 63 of my edition at the bottom. It says she had never been invited to a ball, had never worn white tulle, and now at nearly 40 and scarred by hardships and disappointments, she still felt that early pang, still wondered what in life ought to be classed as trifling and what as grave. And that really struck me. This idea of this life that had moved past a certain point and just like what are kind of girlhood frivolities and what are more serious, and just there's a lot of weight in that line. I think I really liked that one. So back to my notes to myself. Okay, we've covered most of what I had kind of jotted down for book 1. I also noted, in terms of the book as a whole, I mentioned the structure of the different sections and how we kind of time jump between things. So we're seeing these young women at much different ages, and we really lose a lot of that in between. Specifically for Nan, we kind of come back to her very disillusioned in her marriage, as opposed to like seeing her right before it and this kind of like not idealized girlhood, but like a girl who could idealize things, romanticize things, and this idea of what her future was going to look like, and this idea that she had this, specifically that she meets Tintagel at this ruined castle kind of atmosphere, and the like romantic notions of that, and how she kind of built up this idea in her mind based on it. Test Valley specifically mentions her reading a lot of medieval poetry, which I found, I keep saying I found all of it very interesting. But we've got this idea in medieval poetry of courtly love, which is also super present in these books. This idea that you are married to one person, or you're with one person, and you're actually pining after your true love. And there is something in that, like pining, in that sacrifice, that elevates that love and makes it greater. And so I think that is notable, because I think that idea of courtly love based on this poetry that she's been reading then informs a lot of her decisions later, because she is willing to live in that realm of courtly love. She is upholding the decisions of courtly love in terms of sacrificing her love for this other thing while still learning how to speak for herself. So that was really interesting to me. But going back, even with the structure of the sections, we still have this very episodic nature to this, because we really are jumping in and out of these little vignettes, kind of these intense character studies, the real subtleties of these moments. And so there is this action that moves a little slower in a lot of ways, and there is a distance to the narrative. And I want to mention this because if you hang out with me to any extent, one, thank you. Two, I talk sometimes about feeling distant from a narrative and how that impacts me as a reader. Sometimes I don't relate as much to books for that distance, but here I don't think it's so much the distance isn't keeping the narrative at arm's length for me as a reader. It's not making it feel muffled in any way. Rather, the distance is offering more clarity because we are looking at this from the outside, so that we are offering, in some ways, some of these judgments. We're more here. Okay, I wrote, we're more like an impartial observer, like Wharton's prose that cuts right to the heart of a character's nature, sometimes when introducing them, like we see with Lord Britlingsley. I'm mispronouncing that. I'm so sorry. But then I open the question, so feel free to answer the question however you see fit, now or later. How does this distance impact the storytelling and our expectations? So what do we, especially knowing as a reader, I might be going in with much different expectations for this than a different reader because I've read other Wharton endings, but we're also seeing this packaged in relation to Bridgerton in terms of setting expectations for the show for viewers. Bridgerton, if we take Queen Charlotte out of the mix, which still arguably does in a different way, notably has happy endings, right? We feed into a successful love story. Wharton is not known for her successful love stories. So, yeah, just putting that out there. Listen, I used to lead a lot of theatrical talkbacks. So if we can continue this in the future, hopefully I can put that more to good use in terms of proposing questions and engaging in discussion in that way. So, book 2. I have a couple of notes to myself. I really pulled back from writing notes to myself toward the end. You can see I was very, well, maybe you can't see. It's all kind of blending together because this book looks, like I said, like it's from the 90s, but it's not. It's just sat on a shelf where it's weathered. I put tabs in. I put some tabs in. And for me, this is big news. I used a highlighter in the book, partly because it already looks old and I wasn't worried about it. I'm not going to lie. But like here, you can see it. This is like another one of those like character studies and how we get a real insightful, specific view of a character when they're introduced. So this is when Tintagel was introduced. And it says, the Duke of Tintagel was a young man burdened with scruples. Like, what a sentence. I love that sentence. This was probably due to the fact that his father, the late Duke, had none. Like, she's just so witty with her takedowns. So she's like giving us this very insightful clue into why this person is behaving this way. And in many ways, this would be setting up a hero in a romance novel today, right? We have this new lord that has come into a title, probably a duke, because dukes sell well, so they keep emphasizing dukes over other lords in historical romance. And his predecessor, whether it be a father or a brother or what have you, and a distant uncle that he's surprisingly inherited the title from, has kind of made choices that bankrupt the estate or kind of sacrifice the reputation of the family or whatnot. And so you have the kind of classic setup here that moves in a much different direction. Excuse me. And then, okay, so back on point here. In section 2 is where we see on page 81 is where we see the kind of calling out of these differences with the Americans and the Brits, where Lady Britlingsley says, they speak so fast, I can't understand them. And they toss about so, they're never still. So this idea of constant movement, and even that is further emphasized later in the book where it's talking about like the telephones coming to houses for the first time, but how commonplace they are in America, or even the idea of the railroad expansion, which again, we do see a lot in modern historical romance novels. It feels like an oxymoron, but it's not. Like if you look at something like Lisa Kleypas, especially now, you may see heroes more in line with Guy Thornton than with Tintagel. Oh, okay. So I did make note of the Lord Britlingsley. It's on pages 104 through 107. It's almost comical, I would argue, because it's just so honest and frank. Those are synonyms for the same idea, I know, but there specifically I marked down all the girls feared their father less than they did their mother because she sometimes remembered things and he did not. So, not a great not a great sign. And then oh, okay. Speaking, let's talk about Nan a little bit in more specifics. We talked about this idea of her kind of romanticizing things, this idea that she's always been the baby and how she's been contrasted against her older sister Jenny, who is the beauty of the family, but it is almost foreshadowed early in the book that that is not going to be the main signifier, because it says on page 7, and Mrs. St. George suspected that in the circles to which she longed to introduce her daughters, style was valued even more highly than beauty. And I don't know that I would argue that Nan has style, but she has this real, I don't know, honesty about her in some ways. And we do see the style of characters like Jenny and Lizzie playing in the background to these other suitors and how in demand they are, and the kind of little court they set up for themselves at this little cabin by the river. Though we know that cabin, or whatever they call it in the narrative, is a much different conception to what we would have of a cabin today. But Nan doesn't totally fit with this group, and she is her daughter's father's favorite, and she, at the beginning of the book, is still a young girl. She's like 16 at the beginning of the book, and so she's coming out of childhood, and her mother is viewing her future and sitting on the porch and kind of scheming marriages and this idea of entry into society, but we still see this real youthfulness to her that is further elevated by the fact that she is getting a governess. And so we then see this kind of launching into society, but the governess, Miss Testvalley, finds a kind of kindred spirit in her in some ways and nurtures this real love of art and passion and this kind of these romantic leanings. And so with Jenny, we see someone who is much more practical in her matchmaking, and the narrative really presents her as very vapid. So I'm very interested in how the show is going to present her, because she's very two-dimensional in the novel to my reading. She gets more interesting later, especially later in the book. We are so absorbed in Nan's scandal, and yet we see Jenny's scandal playing out in the background, and which scandals are scandals and which scandals are kind of unassuming. Even with Conchita, who, has affairs kind of blatantly throughout the novel, has this kind of philandering husband, is always in need of money. Just what is allowed and what isn't, and how Nan never really feels like she can keep up with this set or belongs or understands this world. And so we have this woman who is being placed in this position to be a duchess because the man that she marries thinks that she is malleable and that he can kind of turn her into what he wants, because he doesn't want to marry someone who just wants him for a title, but he doesn't consider then that the person that he marries really won't have much kind of buy-in in relation to the title, if that makes sense. And so this all comes full circle in the beginning of section 3, where we see what Nan's life in this marriage has been like, or what Nan's life in this marriage has been like, and get this really awful story that we are seeing in reverse, which honestly, I think, or in flashback, I should say, which I think is honestly a good choice because it removes, again, it puts some distance there where we can study it rather than feel immediate in it. And I think I am going to make a prediction that the show will make this a much more immediate thing because they're different mediums. Here, we are really focused on the kind of deadening of how that I don't think that that was the proper word choice in context of the event. So Nan loses a child because of her own actions in the conception of how she and her husband think about the event. In reality, who really knows? Like, yes and no. So in wake of this, she's really kind of cut off all marital relations with her husband. This is a real pivotal moment in this relationship and the kind of start of the breakdown of this relationship and the moment where they both realize that the other person isn't what they have turned them into in their head. Because as much as the Duke hasn't been thinking about Nan in relation to how she actually is, she's kind of been doing the same in some ways. So there is a little bit of equality in how they both have real misconceptions of what this relationship and what this marriage is going to look like. And so this is a kind of, or not a kind of, this is a really traumatic event in Nan's life and is kind of a, I'm losing all my words, but I found it very interesting because at the same time, thinking about how it is portrayed here in like a Wharton novel versus it feels like something that I would expect to see in like the third novel of a Sarah MacLean series, if it's like a 3-novel series. It reminded me of The Day of the Duchess in some ways, but it feels like those stakes are very high. And here, I'm just going to read what I wrote here. In another world, the miscarriage Annabelle has after a fight with Tintagel is the beginning of an angsty and probably series-ending Sarah MacLean novel a la The Day of the Duchess. A great example of how romance can navigate some of these harder topics differently. I have much different expectations of how the story ultimately ends in a Wharton novel versus a MacLean novel. So I found that an interesting kind of thought, clearly, because I raised it. So if you have thoughts in relation to that, let me know. But I think that that was a real turning point for Nan's character. And so we see that really shaking her. And we see a very different Nan in book 3 than we see in book 2. And we're seeing her at much different points of her life. So it's this episodic nature again, where we're getting these snapshots of her that lead to the decisions she makes at the end. And let me see here. Bum, bum, bum. All right. And speaking of the end, we have book 4. And here is what I wrote in regards to book 4. This is the most hopeful Wharton ending I've ever read, and I don't know what to do about it. So I find that very interesting. And this is, again, where I would have loved some more front matter in this book, because I read kind of anecdotally that the reception of this book was kind of divisive, both when it originally came out and when the finished version came out. Because we do not have an ending here that ultimately punishes its female lead. We have an ending where she goes off and it's ambiguous. This is all spoiler, clearly. Sorry, I warned you. And there is this expectation that she has successfully run off with her lover. And not only is it a happy ending for them, but she's facilitating a happy ending for her former husband as well. And putting him or helping put him in a match that is more in line with his needs and wants, and also propping up a friend, kind of trying to position a friend into a similar marriage, or basically they're setting up the younger Almsworth daughter to marry the Duke. And so we see these relationships and we talk about this group of friends. And I find it really interesting because they are so central to the book, but at the same time, they're kind of in the background in a lot of ways to Nan's story. And so we see like these snapshots of these girls. And I feel like I know Lizzie much better at the end of this book than I ever knew her in the beginning, when she's married like this lesser kind of politician, and they're both kind of scheming and on the same page, and they're really probably the happiest marriage in the book, and they're united in this kind of maneuvering, and that was very interesting. But we have this picture of this group of friends and how close they've been, but at the same time it feels the closeness feels false to me in a lot of ways. We see Conchita asking, Nan for money, that kind of starts this whole pile of dominoes in a lot of ways. And there is genuine remorse there. So I think that seeing this on screen will really further the relationships between these young women, which right now the story is very much Nan's story and how they all kind of intertwine and the kind of machinations of all of these people on all sides. But I don't know. I found that really, really interesting. Everything's interesting. I don't know. But if you've read this book and or seen the show, I guess, I don't know how the show ends yet, but I would be very interested to know what your thoughts on the ending are, because it threw me for a loop a little bit. I was like, wait, not everything is awful at the end, especially because we're definitely building there. We have a ruined reputation, we have these limited resources, but there is always that out that is presented here, and that's interesting. So very interested in what you think about how that plays against Wharton's body of work. And because haven't read as much of Wharton's late stuff, I don't know if that is in line with her later writings, if there is a sense of hopefulness there. And it's interesting too, because again, I haven't done the full JSTOR deep dive, but it does seem like a lot of the young women in this novel are based on real people. And there is this idea that in Wharton's novel, you can see these kind of vague outlines of the real behind everything, and that is part of not only their success now, because there is so much truth intertwined with them, but why they were so appealing when they were written. The idea of how popular The Age of Innocence was when it came out, and this idea that it was like a peek into this world you didn't get to see. And so here we have a novel that's like a peek into this world you didn't get to see, this angle of nostalgia, and now we're sprinkling in this hopefulness that is not typically correlated with Wharton, at least in my experience. And so I understand why this is the Wharton novel that's getting picked up for production now. And I will be very interested to see how the show navigates this. I anticipate talking about the show on this channel. If you are interested in that, let me know. I will likely do it anyway, but I would love if people are actually interested in it. But I just am really intrigued by this idea of why this book, why now, what approach is being taken to it. And I definitely understand in wake of the ending what is appealing about this title now. And again, it also is making evident a lot of the kind of jumping off of historical romance that it has inspired. I likely will also be doing a video. Again, let me know if this is something you're interested in, of romances to read after the Buccaneers, if you're interested in the Buccaneers. So like the American heiress and the lord kind of trope, with notably different endings than we see here. But again, we see a lot of those kind of story starts that would be very familiar today. And there is a real kind of modernity isn't the right word, but this feels more immediate, which I know kind of is different than, because I've talked about how the narrative is a lot more distant on purpose to kind of provide this like bird's eye view, this judgmental look at this kind of world, this idea that we're outsiders able to peek into the kind of foibles of this world in whatever way. But it also does feel like characters you would see today. You know, I talked about before Wharton being the impetus of Gossip Girl. Someday I will do a real deep dive on that, maybe. But it feels like it is a world, even in the language of the book, that speaks to the modern experience in some ways, because we are seeing this juxtaposition of new and old money and this excessive wealth and this idea of buying class in some ways. And so there is a way that we can live in this world historically while kind of modernizing it in the production kind of choices, which it seems like, based on the trailer and the fact that I did peek and see that there is modern music in the episodes, that we are going to take that approach. Again, sorry for the noise. I ideally will be upgrading my microphone after the new year, fingers crossed. So let me know if it's too bad right now, and we can assess. But if you have thoughts about this as I'm kind of continuing to babble on, and I apologize that I've just been kind of going off myself, let me know what you're thinking. Yes, perfect. Great, because I have been planning to do it. I ideally wanted to get it out next week. I don't think that's gonna, well, I mean, it will ideally get out sometime next week, but I am not gonna get the whole show watched and a video filmed within the next 48 hours. So it will be coming not quite as expedited as I planned, but definitely something I want to approach. And I thought about starting last night, but I really wanted to be able to approach the conversation of the book with a book only kind of lens. And I knew that it would bleed in if I started watching the show. So I'm very excited to see what perspective is taken with it, especially because, like I said earlier in the stream, I don't know if the BBC version is the end all be all kind of what I don't think that version is going to be what I was expecting it to be. So yeah. So I'm excited to see what this version is. And again, I'm very interested, as I have been, in that conversation. If you haven't watched my video that I put out this week, and you can ignore the fact that I pronounce the Buccaneers as the Buccaneers, I was so confident in it. I didn't bother to look it up. I don't know where I got that, but alas, if you can deal with that, I just have a brief conversation about this kind of idea that I think we're seeing a lot of classics picked up in the vein of like the Buccaneers and Persuasion, and approached in a similar style to Bridgerton in the kind of lens of modernization and the way it's approaching the modernization that is vastly and notably different than something like Little Women, which also I would argue was a modernization, even set in the time period, because these are still set in the time period, but takes a different lens to things. Not saying any of the lenses are bad, but just a very interesting kind of way of looking at things. And I want more classics in kind of new and interesting ways, but I also want more romance novels. So just interested in how that shakes out. But having read this book, I definitely understand, especially if you're looking for something like a classic that has a little bit more social cachet, so to speak, but kind of approaches similar themes to Bridgerton, or things that feel a little bit more modern. Going back, this definitely feels a little bit more modern in just like the frankness, like I said, in which it explores some of these things like affairs, and mostly affairs, but just like the flirtations and the way that young people behave, that feels very reminiscent of, you know, youth as I've experienced it, both being a youth and having observed youths, you know, this kind of like playful giggliness, this, you know, sense that the future feels very far off, this romanticization, this living in the moment, and this kind of scheming that doesn't feel tangible until the weight of that really comes into play with the lives these young women are leading. And I think being able to follow them over the course of their lives in the book is an approach that is very specific. I don't know if it sometimes removes some of the immediacy from the action by, kind of nature of the beast. And so I do have suspicions that that will be cleaned up a little bit for the show. But again, I don't know yet. So I feel like I've covered a lot of the things that I mean, there's always more to talk about, and we could always have another discussion at a future date if desired. I know that I didn't give a whole lot of notification or warning or time to lead up to read the book, so maybe we can try this again, not necessarily with this book, but the format at a future date and time at some point if people still are interested in lives. I don't know. I want to honor your time as well and hope that anyone watching either now or in the future, enjoyed it. And I hope you feel like you can join in on the conversation now or in the future. But that being said, I don't want to overshadow this with Bridgerton because this stands separate from Bridgerton. And I hope the conversation I've been having shows that, right? That I'm not just watching this or reading this because of Bridgerton. I've had this book on my TBR. It's been my break glass in case of emergency Wharton for a while, but I just recently bought A Custom of the Country, so that will surely be. I honestly also probably have all of these in ebook from when Kindle first came out, and you could get any classic for free, but what can you do? So I'm very interested in this and want to be analyzing it for itself. But I also still am interested in Bridgerton. So it's been kind of a hope for a long time that we could also have a kind of read along in whatever form, very loosey goosey, right? Like read at your own speed. I also am very bad at being told what to do. So I recognize that this was not the best medium to maybe have this conversation because it was also last minute. But if we can look ahead to Bridgerton, just let me know if that's something that you would be interested in, having a kind of loosey-goosey read-along of the book and some version of a live discussion of the book in particular. So let me know. But for now, I feel like I'm probably going to wrap this up. So thank you, especially Amy, for being involved in this conversation live. And thank you to anyone in the comments in the replay for being engaged in the conversation after the fact. I appreciate you. I know that it is the holiday season. It is busy. Even if it wasn't the holiday season, it is busy. And for you to give me any of your time it's appreciated. And I recognize what that means. So with that being said, any final thoughts anyone wants to put into the ether, let me know, and we will wrap this up. I know I didn't get quite as detailed into all of the characters and whatnot, so I'm sure we'll get into more of that with the show as well, but all right, speak now or forever. Don't forever hold your peace. You can still speak later. I very much appreciate the engagement, believe me. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to call it a day for now and ideally try to go get some Christmas shopping done, but it is raining. But I also need gift bags for Romance Book Club gift exchange tomorrow. So we will see. So thank you again for tuning in, and I hope to see you again in the future, whether it is live or pre-recorded, but hopefully we can in the new year do some more lives because I do like talking to people in the moment. I enjoy getting to hang out with you all. So thank you for hanging out with me. I feel like I should just go into the normal spiel, but like and subscribe if you feel like it. If you haven't, feel free to jump into the conversation, whenever, but read something good because that's most important. And if you haven't read this book yet, go ahead and read it and come back with your comments. But Thank you for hanging out with me this afternoon, and I will see you later. Bye.